Second Samuel is the chapter that I think a lot of interesting things happens in this chapter, and it's the time in David's life in which, after of course the sin with Bathsheba, the Lord forgives him of that. He said, "Your sins are forgiven," but that doesn't mean that he was going to have to suffer. He was forgiven of the consequences that was going to result of it, and we saw a little bit leading up to this, and now we see the kind of a culmination of events that is happening. It not only affects David, but it affects his family and it affects the nation of Israel. And as we look at chapter 15, we will see, I think David just was blindsided by everything that had happened to him. And my screen went a little on us, didn't it? There we go. Sorry about that. So quickly, just look at some of the people in the context. Of course, we know we have Absalom, but we also have Ahithophel, which was David's counselor. He was he was a counselor that defected to Absalom probably early on in this whole situation. And then with David, we have those that had followed him from Gath, way back in the beginning before he was even king, the Cherethites, the Pelethites, and the Gittites. And then we have Athaliah and the Gittite and 600 men that I believe were with him. As I was reading the text, that's the way I kind of understood it. And then the Levite priest that David sent back to Jerusalem, they came out to him carrying the ark, which was Zadok and his son Ahimaaz, and Abiathar and Jonathan. And then of course we have Hushai, the Achite, which was another one of David's counselors, probably an older one, but he was firmly committed to David and his kingship. So the locations that we have, some of these that were mentioned in relation to some people, we have Geshur, which is where Absalom had fled to, Hebron, which is where Absalom started his rebellion in full force, and then we have Gilo, which they say is where Ahithophel was from. Then we have Gath, and then we have the brook Kidron, and I'm not sure where this was at. I never could find it on a map, but I think it's someplace between Jerusalem and maybe the Mount of Olives. And then we have the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and I believe this is where David worshiped God. It said when he got to the top of the mountain, he worshiped God. And when we look at these particular places, I don't know if you can see that or not, but really the points of interest, if I can get my thing to come up here, is that Jerusalem, being right here, the Mount of Olives is just right outside the city itself. And when you read the fact that when David left the city, and as soon as he got outside and before he went to the Mount of Olives, he took inventory of all the people that came out with him. So that happened right up in here. And excuse me. And when he fled into the wilderness, not sure where that wilderness was at, but I'm kind of thinking it may be right up in this particular area someplace, or it may be over in here someplace. Because we're told in chapter 18 that David goes, he said he crosses the river and goes to Mahanaim. I have trouble with these names. So anyway, when he flees Jerusalem, he goes to the Mount of Olives, and in this general direction, he's probably up in here someplace in the wilderness. And this being the plains of the River Jordan. And then of course, Absalom was down here where he begins his rebellion. And so David actually has a little bit of time to flee and get out to save his life and to save those that are in the city. So when we look at this particular chapter, I think there's about 7 points that need to be brought out. In the first 6 verses, we see that Absalom makes himself appear someone as important. He steals the hearts of the people. And then in verses 7 through 9, Absalom seeks David's permission to go to Hebron to fulfill a vow he had made to God to serve him. And whether or not he actually made this vow is in question, considering what he's about to do. Then in verses 10 through 12, Absalom sends spies throughout Israel, and his conspiracy grows strong, and he gains the support of the people. David learns what is happening and makes plans to flee to Jerusalem in 13 through 14. 15 through 23, we see that David and his servants flee, leaving his concubines to tend to the house while he leaves and his servants. And he quickly determines that as he gets outside the gate, all who are with him. 24 through 29, David sends the priests back to Jerusalem as informants for him. And then in 30 through 37, we see that David worships God, and he sends Archite and Hushai back to Jerusalem as informants with the priest. Now, some introductory thoughts to this. As I read through the chapter and kind of ran through it and kind of mulled over it, first thing that came to my mind was, how old was David when all these events happened? And the best thing that I could come up with was that David was about 65 years old. He's probably in his mid-60s sometime when this happened. And if that's the case, he's probably in about the 35th year of his reign. So it's towards the end of his reign when Absalom tries to take the throne from him. Now, when I read through this chapter and all the events that were going on, the first thing that came to my mind was, where in the world is Joab? You know, Joab was the commander of the army. And if the king was having problems, the army was going to be there to shore up the king. So where was the army at this time? Where was Joab at this time? Well, I don't know, but we do know a few things. In 2 Samuel 17, verse 25, we see that Absalom replaced him with Amasa as captain of the army. And then later, in chapter 18, we see that David put a third of his forces under Joab's command. So, two things might have happened. He may have fled with David, or he may have stayed to try to keep the army under control and in David's command and in his favor, but failed to do so. And when he saw that his command was taken away from him, then he left and went to David. I kind of think that might have been it. I kind of think, you know, Joab was a man that was an opportunist, and he was going to make sure that whatever happened was going to be in his best interest. He didn't think Absalom was a good interest to fall into at the time, so he stayed with David, and I think he tried to keep the army together and tried to get it to where the army was going to protect the throne for David's sake, but it didn't happen. But we do know, when we read in 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 28, the text tells us that that David, in fact, did not defect to Absalom. So whatever Joab did not defect to Absalom. So whatever Joab was doing, I think, was for trying to do this for David's benefit. Again, doing some damage control for the king. Now, what is interesting about all of this is that the 4 years that all of this was being made, was coming about, and when the uprising finally happened, David was totally unaware of these events. When it was finally brought to his attention, it probably just stunned him to no end that he's just about to lose his kingdom. And I think it's kind of interesting. How could these things be happening under his nose without him knowing what was going on? So, back to the chapter. Now, Absalom did 3 things to gain the trust of the people. And when I read through this and I kind of put all this together, it's kind of like what David Pratt said in his book. You know, he's a typical politician that we see today. And the first thing he did was he built himself up, and then he tore his opposition down. And when you can do that and get the people's favor, then you get the vote. And so that's what Absalom did. First thing he did was he put on a display to the people of how great this man was. He provided himself, as it says in verse 1, provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. In other words, whenever he went someplace, it was in grand appearance. I mean, you just couldn't miss him coming down the road with the chariots and the horses and men running before him. And so he had a good display. He made himself up. He put on a good suit and made himself look good. Second thing he did was he rose up early and he met the people at the gate coming in, and those that had concerns that they were going to go to see a judge or try to see David himself, he'd take them off to the side and listen to what their cause was, and they would say, you know, you have a just cause, you have a righteous cause, but the problem is there's just nobody in Jerusalem that will hear you. You know, there's no judges, there's no representatives of the king to hear your cause. But you know, if I were the judge of this king of this nation, I would listen to each and every one that came through this gate. So you see now, building himself up, and he's now beginning to tear down David and his judicial system. So he was making himself as popular as he could. And then he said that when people came to bow down before him, he said he would hold them by the hand, pick them up and kiss them. You know, just like a politician kissing a baby. He just was showing them that I am not only a great man, and I'm willing to listen and I can give righteous judgment, but I'm just like you are. You know, I put, you know, my shoes on just like you do. There's nothing about me that is elevated above you. I care about you, and you are just, you know, we're one together. So you see how he begins to politic his position with the people. And when you start doing this over a period of 3 or 4 years, and all the people coming in and out of Jerusalem, and he was meeting them each and every day, he was beginning to gain a following. And when people were coming in from all over the nation to Jerusalem, and as they were leaving, they were going back and saying, this Absalom, he's a great man. You should really listen to him. So he was really doing a great thing for himself. And what is amazing to me is that when all of this was going on, it was not coming to David's ears. And I think one of the things that Absalom did, probably right up front, was to get David's counselor into his fold, so to speak. And when he decided that Absalom was going to be the next king, that David's counselor was keeping these events from David's ears. So David was being left in the dark, and I think his counselor was doing that. That was, I won't mispronounce his name again, but Ahithophel or something like that. So that's 3 or 4 things that he was doing. And the result was that after 4 years of this, people were falling for his guys and for his line that he was putting out, and they were becoming his supporters. Now, the Bible says on chapter 7 that it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said to the king. Now, there's some discrepancy here, and nobody, you know, I found 2 or 3 different answers to this. Some say that it was a typo or a scribe's typo as he was copying this, because certainly 40 years did not pass. It was a 4-year reign. Josephus says it was 4 years. The Septuagint version says it was 4 years. The Syriac version says it was 4 years. But when I started looking at what the Jews were saying today in their Talmud, they said that it was 40 years, but it started at they did the counting from the reign of Saul. So if you did the counting from the reign of Saul up to the time, it's probably around 40 years. You know, that could be one of the answers, but I just don't know. But I do know that it was not 40 years from the time that he started his rebellion against David. Now he asked David to let him go to Hebron because when he was in Geshur, he had made a vow saying, if I ever return back to Jerusalem, then I would serve the Lord. Now, I think that this may have been a downright lie to David, because we do not see him serving the Lord when he goes to Hebron. In fact, what he does is he raises a nation up against the anointed king of God. That is not service to God when you decide that you want to destroy the one that God said will sit on my throne. So what made Hebron important, I think, was that Absalom was born in Hebron. That was his birthplace. And going back to his birthplace, he was probably telling them, I am one of you. This is where I was born. You're my people. Now you remember David had his capital in Hebron. But when the nation all became united under David, what did he do? Well, he packed his bags and he went to Jerusalem. He abandoned you. He left you. You see, Absalom could be using Hebron as a springboard, getting the people in Hebron united under him, and again, this began to spread out to the nation. He sends spies out throughout the nation, and we see that today. What I've seen over in, what's happening in Ukraine and Russia and all those little countries over there, is that Russia is sending people into these countries, and they're converting the people to think that Russia is a whole lot better than having your freedom. And we're seeing, a lot of problems over there. Well, that's what Absalom was doing here. He was sending spies out into the country, and they were saying, David's he's an old man. You need someone young in the throne to lead this country. Absalom, his son, and probably by birthright, is the heir apparent to the throne. And this is the man you need to follow. But they said, when you hear the horns blowing, then you need to go out and as loud as you can and say, Absalom is now king and reigns in Hebron. So whenever you hear the announcement, you scream this as loud as you can and as often as you can throughout the country, and that everyone knows that David has now fallen and that Absalom has taken his place. So Absalom was not a dummy. He had everything perfectly planned out on how to get the people to vote for him, so to speak, cast out the old man that's on the throne, and just ride him right into Jerusalem as the new king. So Absalom was a sly fellow, and he knew how to take care of these events. Now, with that said, the second thing I think that we need to think about is David's counselor that he had in Jerusalem. And his counselor, what was his name? It's a long, funny name. Ahithophel. When the people saw that David's counselor was now Absalom's counselor, that put a lot of legitimacy to Absalom's claim to the throne. Because why would the king's counselor defect from the sitting king and go to Absalom? With this counselor standing by Absalom, I think there was an image put out that David was no longer relevant as a king, and that he no longer needs to be ruling. So his conspiracy grows, and these things were going in Absalom's favor. Now, we see in verse 13, it says, and the messengers came to David saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. And so David said to his servants who were with them at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. Make haste and depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring us disaster upon us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. A couple of things that David had into consideration. First of all, I don't think he wanted to see Jerusalem sieged and destroyed, because that's probably what was going to happen. He didn't want to see the city where he had established the Ark of the Covenant and was going to build the temple being destroyed by his son. And the second thing is he realized how bad the situation was when he found out that it looked like Joab was losing control of the army, the people were rising up against him, and the forces that he had around him in the city was not enough to delay what was going to happen. So his best bet was to let's vacate, let's run to the wilderness, and let's hide out there until we can get a better situation, a better grip on what's happening, and then God make the decision about how it's going to turn out. So David, I guess, he was stunned, first of all, that this was happening, but I think he had enough wisdom about him to understand that staying in place was not going to be good for him or the city or for the nation itself. So it says that the servants that were willing to go with him got the household together and went with them. And he left his 10 concubines to take care of the house. I couldn't figure that one out to save my life, and I still can't figure that one out. But they were left there, and the king went out with all the people, and as soon as they got out of the city, he stopped and he had all the people pass before him to see who was with him and how many were there. And from that we see that he had the Cherethites, the Pelethites, the Gittites, 600 men who had followed him from Gath, passed before the king. And then there was another fellow by the name of Attai, a Gittite, who had been exiled from his own country and only arrived there, he said, yesterday. So this was a new guy that just showed up. And David had told him, he said, you don't really need to come with me. He said, I'm just going to lead you into misery. He said, go back into the city, return to the king. I think at this point he already considered Absalom being the king of the nation. He said, return to your king and do his bidding. And he said, you'll have my blessings in doing that. He said, you don't need to suffer my suffering. And the man told David, he said, as the Lord lives and as my Lord the king lives, surely in whatever place my Lord the king shall be, whether it be in death or in life, even there also your servant will be. You know, that is a commitment of a man's faith in another man, to be with him thick and thin in all things. And you just don't find that, not even in the closest of friends. You just don't find a person willing to give his life for someone else in a situation like this. And so David said, go and cross over. And his men and his families, they all crossed over. And he said, all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people crossed over. And the king crossed over the brook Kidron, and all the people crossed over toward the way of the wilderness. Now it said when all the people were wailing, and we'll see this later on in this chapter, that the people were seeing a bad situation. They were seeing the king being kicked out of Jerusalem. He was on the run. And it was not only bad enough, but it was his son doing it to him. And they could just see, or they could just feel the sorrow that David was feeling at this particular time. Now Zadok and the priest that were bearing the Ark of the Covenant, David came down there with them. He set the Ark down as the people were crossing over, and David went over and told them, he says, take the Ark back to Jerusalem, that's where it belongs. He says, if it be that I find favor in God's sight, I will be returned to the Ark. But if God does not see that I'm fit to be king, then I will face the judgment of God and accept the consequences of his judgment. And then the Ark will be safe where it needs to be. But he also told him, he said, when you turn to the city, you and your sons, he said, you need to do me a favor. He said, you need to keep your ears open and your eyes open about what's happening. And send word to me about events that are happening in Jerusalem so that I may know how serious this is going, what Absalom is going to do, especially in the case of following after me, trying to do me harm. I need to have eyes and ears in Jerusalem, and you are the people that can do that for me. So they agreed to it, and they took the ark back to Jerusalem, and there they remained. Verse 30, it says, David went up to the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and he wept as he went. His head was covered, he went barefoot, and all the people who were with him covered their heads and went up weeping as they went. And then someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And this is probably the first time David understood the extent of this conspiracy. When his counselor was among Absalom's spies in Jerusalem, he now probably could see how these things were kept from him, and that he was probably told one thing when other events were happening in a different way. And if anybody was coming to see the king, this man was the one that intervened and kept the real news from the king. So David said to the Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. In other words, whenever he gives counsel to Absalom, let it be sheer foolishness that Absalom will fail. Now it says when he came to the top of the mountain where he worshiped God, there was Hushai the Archite coming to meet him with his robe torn and dust on his head. And Hushai was the other counselor that David had. This was probably an older man and one that was definitely true and faithful to David as a counselor to him. He wanted to go with David, but he said, "You'll slow me down." So evidently his age was against him in this particular matter. But he said, what you can do is this: return back to Jerusalem, go to Absalom and say, even as Ahithophel was David's counselor, so was I. Ahithophel will serve you, I will serve you in the same capacity. But David said, you can use your wisdom and your judgment to thwart anything that Ahithophel may give to him. So if it sounds like Ahithophel is giving him good counsel, give counsel that would show where it would be foolishness and defeat anything that he may do that may cause me harm. And he said, and when you do find these things out, pass it along to Zadok and Abiathar, the priest, and their sons, and they will come to where I'm at and tell me all that's going on. And so that's what he did. He went back to Jerusalem and became his counselor. And then it said that Absalom came into Jerusalem, and there he took his throne. Now that's a quick summation of events of what happened. We have the king totally taken off guard about an uprising. We see civil war about to happen in Israel, and we not only see this, but the nation of Israel is saying we are about to suffer the consequences of a family feud. A man, Absalom, fighting his father for the throne. And this is not good for the family, and it's not good for the nation. So we can see why they were weeping for David, because they knew that God had anointed David for the throne, and now it appears that by cunning and underhandedness, it was being taken away from them. So what are some of the lessons that we can learn from this? First of all, do not be complacent and unaware of the evil that lurks around you. I think David may have found himself in that position, especially he's 65 years old, been there for 35 years, trusted counselors. I think he became complacent in his rule and really wasn't aware of what was happening. And then, when we look at Absalom, never gain someone's trust by using vain methods. He used vain methods to gain these people's trust, and we should not follow the same method that he did. Never trust those who use vain methods to gain your trust. If people are trying to gain your trust, make sure that they're not doing it in a vain way for their own benefit or for their own glory. And next, don't be like Absalom and speak evil of others to attain your own personal goals. You've always heard the saying that he'll step on top of his own mother to get to the top of where he wants to go. And a lot of people are like that. So don't speak of others to attain your own personal goals. You can do it on your own integrity. And like those who wept for David, people do feel your suffering when you are faced with adversity. And then when you face sudden adversities in life, do not blame God, but go to God in worship, like David did. It was very easy for David to blame God for all that was happening to him at this moment. One day he woke up as king, and by the end of that day, he was a vagabond. And it would be very easy for him to say, God has done this to me, and it's his fault that I'm in the way that I am. But instead, he goes to the top of the mountain and he worships God. And that's the same thing that we should realize here. So there's a lot of things happening in this chapter, and there's a lot of events that, when you start unraveling it, we can see the trouble that the nation of Israel was in. So if there's any questions or comments, just about out of time. Did it go over y'all's head? You up with me? Okay. In the next 2 or 3 chapters, we're going to see the extent that Absalom is going to go to secure his throne, and we're going to see his eventual death, and we're going to see David's reaction. And again, we see Joab's intervention. Thank you for your time.